Hey everyone, in this video we're going to cover problem number 1 in the collections problem set, which is as follows. You ingest weekly product lists from multiple vendors. Each vendor uses their own alias for a product. A separate file maps every alias to SKU, which is your unique identifier, right? And the task is to build the unique set of SKUs your platform will offer this week. So this will involve you having to map your SKU to the vendor's aliases, right? That can be something as follows. So once you perform the alias, you will know what are the unique set of SKUs that can be offered on your platform this week. Think about a platform like Amazon, where there are several sellers on the platform at any given point, and Amazon has to figure out at any given point what are the products that are available from any given seller, and what is the stock, what is the price, and so forth. Right? We'll go through a little demonstration in a moment. The next task is compare the last week's SKU to find new and discontinued items. So you want to find the new set of products or new set of SKUs that will be offered this week. You want to find also discontinued products compared to the last week. So this will implicitly mean that you need the data from the last week's product list, essentially. All right. And then finally, flag any data quality issues. What if there are unknown aliases? You want to make sure those are tackled. What if there are alias conflicts, right, within your alias map .csv that we'll touch upon in a moment? Then we need to tackle those as well. Now, to make sure we can comprehensively solve this problem, we need a few inputs. So to begin with, we have alias map.csv. What is alias map.csv? Let's get to that in just a second. What we'll first start off with is actually, let's start off with the vendor CSVs. That's a starting point in this problem, right? So let's say you are this platform, Amazon, right? And on Amazon, there are several sellers, right, who will offer their products for sale that we all can buy. Now, Amazon will be given, for example, something like a product list from these sellers. So a product list from a seller is really just the product that they're trying to sell, the price for individual products, and the stock available for this product, right? That's the idea here. And a different seller will, in this case, we'll try to follow the same sort of approach for a different seller as well. So they will also give us a product, the price, and the stock for any given product. So this is a product for the seller, right? But for us, it is going to be called an alias. Why is that? Well, we are going to have products. Let's say we have a product name that is something like this: Galaxy S24 Ultra, let's say U256 black, or let's say Ultra 256 GB black, right? So it's a little different than what exists in the seller's product catalog or product list. Now, this is not enough to uniquely identify a product. Usually in a product catalog, there is something called an SKU, which is the stock keeping unit, right? So stock keeping unit is nothing but a unique ID, or you can think about it that way, associated with the product in your product list, right? So let me just bring up an example that we have here of an alias map, right? So let me take this here, for instance, and we will split this. So we will need to split this so we can use this appropriately, right? Now let's apply that across, and now we have something which we can use. So here we have an alias mapping to an SKU. So we're going to set up the header here for an alias, and let me paste this, and now we can remove this. So now we have an alias here mapping to an SKU, right? So as I said earlier, the product right? For the product for seller A is, for example, Galaxy S24 Ultra and so forth, right? 256 GB, whatever. We take that product here and we convert that to lowercase. So we're kind of normalizing it so we can perform search and so forth easily later. Now, that is the alias in our system. So this is on our platform now, right? Not on the seller. Now we take this alias and map it to a unique SKU on our platform. This unique SKU will be mapping to a single product in our system, right? But this SKU can have a one-to-many relationship to the seller's products, right? A seller may have something like this. One of the products can be S928B and so forth. And it can have a price, let's say something like 1098. They're trying to undersell seller A here, let's say. Right, they have 10 units or stock. So both of these products here actually map to the same SKU for us, right? Notice that here. We have both of these mapping to the same SKU, right? So that is one of the aspects we'll have to consider once we start solving this problem, right? And we may have different product names that will be shown to the user at the end. But this is what we're going to focus on for us right now, okay? So that is a high level on this problem. You will be given essentially the product list from the seller, and it could be one or more sellers. You'll be given the alias, right, to SKU mapping for the platform we are running, and we'll be given one more thing, which is what are the SKUs we have seen in the last week, right? So for example, if we are currently on November 3rd, right, let's assume these were the SKUs we saw last week, okay? So the week before, 1 week prior to now, November 3rd, right? Now, the next week, the seller will again send us these product lists, and we must now map them, perform the mapping given our set of SKUs. So we have a set of SKUs, and we have a set of aliases that we know the seller would usually provide to us. So we have to perform a mapping here, right? And for us to finally solve this bullet point here, which is what are the what are the unique set of SKUs we're going to be offering this week, and what is going to be discontinued. We need to be able to compare the last week's SKU to what is finally offered this week, right? So for November 3rd, for example. So that is one more mapping we're going to have to perform. So, and one more data structure we'll have to use to store that data, right? So that is on a high level the problem we're talking about here, okay? So let's switch over to IntelliJ. Let me close up the existing windows, and let's open up the catalog aggregator.java. Right. So we'll start off by creating a main, and we'll use and then use certain configurations which we've created during the lecture. So this is the catalog aggregator configuration which we created during the lecture, right? The key aspect here is the CLI arguments which we are using, right? So let me copy that here so it's evident what we are using here. So we are essentially providing the path to each of our CSVs in the resources folder, right? So I've created some sample input files, CSVs for the alias map. Just last week's SKU is a very simple TXT file. We are not trying to capture additional data. It'll make the problem more complicated, right? So we have the aliases to SKU map in a CSV. We have the SKUs that we've seen previously in a TXT file. And then for any vendor that will provide us any product list, we have alias, price, and stock. These are the mandatory fields. So alias is nothing but just the product name for that vendor. Price and then stock, both integers. Right? So then same thing for a different vendor with just some different data, right? So that is our input to this to this program. So we are essentially taking the file names and the path from the top level of this project from SRC, right? SRC in main, and in resources we have catalog sample, and we have all 4 files. So that's exactly what we're doing here. We're providing the path, the relative path, which is separated by a space at each level. So when we provide this as an argument in our configuration in IntelliJ, this is inputted, or this is parsed and provided as arguments for our project or our program. So you can actually print out, for example, for var I is equal to 0, I is less than args.length. So you can print out each of these, right? So args sub I, for instance. So you should. So these are the first steps you want to be able to take when you're trying to solve such problems, right? What is the input? All right. Can we identify the input files? Great. Now we want to be able to go and read these files, right? So that'll be a step we'll get to very soon as well, right? So on a high level, we'll try to break down the problem so we have a good understanding of what do we need to do before we start writing a lot of code, right? So first thing first, we want to be able to perform some validation, right? Validation in this case can include can be as simple essentially as checking the length of the args array, right? We at least expect an alias map CSV that should be at index 0. We expect the SKUs we saw last week, that's a txt file at index 1. Then from index 2 and above, we should see the vendor files essentially, right? These are the vendor product lists. So that's one expectation we have when this program will execute, right? So args sub 0 will actually contain the alias map, right? Args sub 1 will contain the last week's SKUs, and we have args sub 2 or above essentially will have the vendor product list, right? That's what we're expecting here. So you can perform a validation. We should at least have one alias map, one txt file for the last week SKU, and one vendor product list, right? So first step would be perform the validation, check whether we have at least 3 files, right? That should be one. You can go further into this, right? You can literally write a helper method to go further into this to make sure the first one is actually a CSV, second one is a TXT, and third, if there are 3 or more files, right, all of those, everything after or equal to index 2 should also be a CSV, right? You can even go further and do validation on the files, right? Do they actually have alias and SKUs as header for the alias map, right? You can really go deep into this and perform the validation. And in a real world scenario, you would absolutely do that, right? You perform the validation before you go ahead and execute your code, all right? But for now, we'll keep it relatively simple, but I'm going to leave some comments for us to come back and fill in later. So the next part is, once we've performed the validation, we want to construct the path objects, right? We have the path, we want to be able to construct the path, and we want to eventually be able to start reading the file, right? To read the input files. That's the idea here, right? So we'll construct the path to read the input files. And one key aspect we need to consider is, once we start reading the files, we need to represent the data in each of these files in memory. Meaning we'll have to declare variables to store the data in our memory, right? So as a result, we'll have to declare variables to store the input data in memory, right? So that will include a couple of sort of variables. And for instance, you'll start off with, for instance, the um, the alias map, right? So we have an alias to the SKU map, right? So we need an alias to SKU map. So when I say a map, think immediately about collection in Java. Think, always remember the key collections we learned, right? Collection data structures we learned, right? So these are data structures, meaning just nothing but way to store data, right? We learned about list, we learned about queue, we learned about essentially map, right? And we also learned about the final one was set, right? So we learned these four. So we want to be able to consider as we're looking through this data, which of these can be useful for us, right? So that's the idea. And an alias to SKU map is nothing but a key value pair. You can go either from alias to SKU, or you might even need to go from SKU to alias, right? So consider the use benefits there, right? So if you're going to from alias to SKU map, we'll likely need a hash map in this case, right? That's what. We will need to track, for instance, let's do the flip side of this, right? Alias to SKU map, right? So the flip side of this would be essentially the SKU to sort of alias map, right? So what if you needed to track the SKU to alias map in this case, right? And what is the use case? So you have SKU to alias map, right? What is the use case for this? Well, the use case can be, let's say you're asked to generate a report in this scenario, right? And the report says, hey, for each SKU in our system, these are the aliases available, or at least the aliases that we track, right? The alias to SKU doesn't give us that information directly, right? This can be a map that tells us that essentially gives us the aliases, right, for a given SKU, right? Now this if it's an alias to SKU, right, the key is alias, the value is SKU. So it's actually a string and a string key value pair, where the first string is an alias and second is an SKU, right? So you could run into scenarios where aliases are duplicated, right, across different sellers, and they all map to the same SKU, right? So we don't really get to know how frequently an alias is duplicated across different sellers. What do I mean by that? Let's say this seller has product A, right? And this seller also has product A, and they have the appropriate price and a stock. Now, in our alias to SKU map, we have product A mapping to prod A, right? Now, in our alias to SKU map in our program, where every time we map these, this is the key, right? And this is the value. We will not store a frequency of number of times we come across this alias, for instance, right? So we can use alias to SKU map for a reason and SKU to alias map for another, right? So we'll consider these as one potential use case. Right? Now, another one that is defined by the problem itself is actually it is on conflicts, right? You can run into conflicts in terms of where the same alias is mapped to different SKUs in the alias map, right? So what could happen is, what if product A maps to product A, and product A also maps to product B? That is a problem in our system, right? Because we should only have a single SKU to alias mapping in our system, right? Let me rephrase that. For a given SKU in our system, we can map to n number of aliases, but we should never have two SKUs mapping to the same alias. That's a conflict in our system, right? Because now when an alias comes and we need to map it, How do we know which SKU in our system is appropriate? Is it prod A? Is it prod B? That's a confusion, right? So we should be able to avoid such conflicts and tag them essentially. These are data quality issues, right? So we'll need to track that as well, right? So we'll need something like, say, conflict aliases, let's say, and this can be a unique sort of set of values, right? A unique set of aliases, actually, right? So even if you have 5 different aliases, right, and there are 3 duplicates, we just need a unique set of values in this case. So this can be essentially a set. That's the idea here, right? Now, with this, we'll still need additional details, like for example, unknown aliases and others. We'll cover those as we proceed. But let's take a moment and actually start planning out how we're going to process the input, right? So we have 4 files we need to process. How do we process that, right? So let's start mapping some of the helper methods we're going to need to declare. So usually before you write code, I would highly encourage you take a moment, sort of write some pseudocode. This is what you call essentially pseudocode. Just writing some comments, trying to figure out, okay, how do I solve this problem, right? And then you might adapt your solution accordingly, okay? So what we need to be able to process the files would be, we need a few methods, right? We need to load a few files and process them. So one file that we need to process would be the alias map, right? The alias to SKU map. So we would have a method, let's say load alias map, right? And what does this need as parameters? Well, it definitely needs to read a file, so it needs a path, right? And we need to compose a map of alias to SKU, right? Since we're going to declare at the main top level in the main method, we can use Java's pass by reference feature, right? So if I declare a reference variable in the main, and if I pass it down to a helper method, for instance, and I update it in this method, well, in Java, that will allow us to update the original variable declared in main, right? So we can use that feature to essentially not have to declare a variable in this method and we don't have to return it, for instance. Okay. You can absolutely take that path also. It is just not something we need to in this case. Right? So another one we need is if you're going to parse the alias map, we also need to consider the conflicting aliases, right? So we need to worry about aliases as we're parsing the alias to SKU map, right? So conflict aliases is going to be something we need to consider, and we need to be able to populate this set also. So we'll pass it again to this method, okay? And if we are actually going to construct this SKU to alias map for any reports, any output later, we could actually pass that also, the SKU to alias map. And we can essentially make sure the alias to SKU and SKU to alias is well defined for us. So one thing we have to consider on this data structure, SKU to alias, right, is that now alias to SKU is you have, for example, an alias coming Galaxy S24, and it maps to a single SKU, right? But an SKU to alias can actually be a one-to-many mapping, right? As we said earlier. So this key here can have multiple values, right? So because this exact key is actually duplicated here because we have different values that are aliases for this SKU, right? So we could use a hash map here, right? And we could store a map of, for example, string, right, as the SKU, and the value is going to be the interesting part, right? So the key is a string, which is fine, but we can have multiple values, right? So you could use, for example, a list of string would be one potential one. I would not recommend a list of string in this case because there's a better data structure we can use, we can automatically keep a unique set of values, right? So as a result, I would recommend set instead of a list in this case. Okay, so you can keep a hash map and then have a set of string as a result. Consider why this is useful. Really think about each of the data structures and see why this actually is the right solution or ideal solution, I should say. All right. Now, that is essentially going to allow us to load the alias map, parse the data, and store it in appropriate data structures where we will use it. Now, that is one file which we can now read, or once we implement this, we can read, right? But what about the SKU list, right? So we have a txt file which has the last week's SKU list, right? So we need to be able to read this also. So we can have a method, for example, to load the SKU list, right? What do we need here? Well, we really just need the path, right? We're going to be reading a file, so we need the path. And this method is going to just pretty much return the unique set of SKUs, right? Could you follow the same pattern we had here where we declared a variable in the main and used pass by reference to update it in via load alias map? You could, but in this case, it's probably going to be an overkill. Right, you can just provide the path, and this function or this static method can return pretty much the set, unique set of SKUs from last week, right? So we see a lot of set use cases here, and it's a set of string, right? Because what if there's a duplicate in the last week SKUs, right? So here, let's say we have two of these, len and dash something, right? So you don't want to have multiple duplicates stored in memory, right? It's not going to help us in any way. So that can be another method. Then finally, our next set of input is the vendor product list, right? So we could have a method to load vendor file, for example, and we can go through each vendor file, right? We can go through a for loop in the main, right? Pass each vendor file's path to this load vendor file, and it can go ahead and process the vendor file also for us, right? So we can go ahead and read the file, understand, okay, what do we need here, right? We have alias, price, and stock, right? Process them and store it in our appropriate data structures. So what are those data structures? Well, we definitely, when we're going to be processing the vendor file, we're going to need a few things, right? We are going to need, for example, we need to be able to compare the alias, right? Alias to SKU mappings, right? We need that. So if we go back here, one thing we need is, absolutely, we need the alias to SKU mapping. That is required. What else do we need? Well, we would also need, for instance, the SKUs for, so we could have, so there are two outcomes we need from this method, right, static method. We need to know what are the new SKUs, right? So if you go back to the problem statement, right, we need to know what are the new set of SKUs we offer this week, right? That is one thing required by the problem. What about discontinued SKUs, right? Or unknown SKUs and so forth, right? So we also need to consider these. So at the very least, what we can set up is, we can set up some data structure to store the unique set of SKUs we will provide this week. And then we can also track unknown aliases, all right? I will come back to why we can, there's another way to tackle the discontinued items part, all right? So let's come back to that. You could absolutely store that in a, in memory as you process each file, but there's a little better way, so we'll come to that one, okay? So what we're going to then need is, we're going to need, before we eventually call load vendor file, right? So if we go back and look at the main now, right? So once we have these kind of data structures, we could actually go ahead and call load alias map, right? So now we can load the alias map with this approach, right? Once that is done, we could load the SKU list as well. So that can be the next thing we load. Because this is a pretty straightforward one, right? Just reading a text file and then mapping it or parsing it and storing the data. Then we're going to need something additional for load vendor file, right? So before we call load vendor file, what do we need, right? We need to again declare variables to store the vendor data, right? So what do we need for that? Well, we're going to need, for instance, the week, right? The new SKUs, right? So we need something like this week's SKUs, right? So we need that. This week's SKU, right, is just a unique set of SKUs essentially, right? So we can actually have a set of string here. So what is the absolute minimum set of SKUs we will offer, this seller will offer, right, on our platform. And also we need to track the unknown aliases, right? So unknown aliases, remember, it just appears in the vendor files, but we don't have it in our alias map. So we cannot find it in our map. So again, this can be a unique set of aliases. So unknown aliases can be another. So it's a set of string. Okay. Now, then with this, we should be able to call a vendor load vendor file, and we'll provide the path. We'll provide the SKU mapping, alias to SKU mapping. Right. We'll provide the data structures to store this week's SKUs and unknown aliases. Right. The reason, consider why we're declaring them here. Right. These are going to be shareable data across vendors. Right. Because we need it for our platform. It's not just about storing the vendor data in a method, which then cannot be accessed by our platform. And think about it that way. Okay. Now, with that, we have a decent sort of initial starting point, right? We now know how to read different kinds of input files. We kind of understand what is the way to store the data that we're going to be parsing, and now we can go ahead and store the data, and then we'll go ahead and solve the problem at the end, right? So in terms of the SKUs offered and so forth. Okay. So let's now go ahead and code. So to begin with, we have a validation that we're going to perform, right? So let's say we have args.length. In this case, it's if we at least don't have 3 files, there's no point in proceeding further, right? So in this case, you can either throw, for example, an exception here, because that is absolutely fine, right? You can throw something like a throw new illegal argument exception, for instance, because we don't have the appropriate set of arguments, right? So that can be thrown for, or you can also just, in this case, since we're not building a real world system, you can just print out some error message as well, right? But let me comment this out for now, because we'll just print out an error message. We'll use system.error, oops, not exit, .error.println, and we can print out invalid arguments, for instance. We expect expected input would be alias map, followed by last week's SKUs, followed by vendor product list, right? Then the next part would be we want to construct the path for our files. So assuming this validation is sufficient for our problem, we can now construct the path to the files, right? So we'll create a path object in Java, right? And first we need the path to the alias map, right? And then we also need it for last week's SKUs, so that we can call these methods down here, right? So we will create an alias map path, and we will use the path of method in this case. And what do we need to pass to it? We can pass essentially a string which is in this case args sub 0. That's one. We also need, oops, that's map. We also need to pass last week path, right? We need to track this as well. And that is at args sub 1, right? That's all. With this, we pretty much have the path variables. We will take care of the vendor files because this is an unknown number of input files, right? It could be 1 or it could be 10. So in this case, we are kind of hard coding it to 2, right? We just have 2, right? But in ideal scenario, you have to handle the scenario where this is an unknown number of input files. Okay. So now with that, let's declare our data structures from collection framework, right? So we're going to declare, for instance, in this case, we have a map of string, and the value is a string for our alias to SKU, right? So for any given alias, we will only have one SKU, right? We should only have one SKU, really, right? And it's going to be a hash map, right? And that's going to be the first one. So the next one is we will need to track the SKU to alias map, right? So the reverse of this one, alias to SKU. Okay. So we will have a map of string, which is the key. So we have the SKU as the key. The value is going to be, it could be multiple actually values, right? It could be multiple strings, which will be the aliases for a given SKU, right? So what we can do here is we can actually say this will be of a set of string, right? So we'll have a first set, so we need to import the set interface, and then we can declare our variable, right? And we can instantiate this map, right? So as a hash map, for instance. That's it. The next one, we need to track the conflict aliases, right? So remember, just conflict aliases is nothing but aliases that are mapped to different SKUs in the alias map, right? So you may have two aliases, a single alias mapping to two different two different SKUs, for instance, right? So we need to track that. So in this case, we need to, let's say, declare a set, right? We're going to declare a set of string, right? And it's going to be conflict aliases. And we'll instantiate a new. We have learned about a hash set, right? We also learned about a linked hash set. But in this case, the hash set is sufficient for our data storage, right? We don't really care about the order in which the conflict aliases are stored, which is what link hash set provides, right? So hash set is sufficient for us. Now, that is our declaration of variables that we're going to need to use to call this method, load alias map, right? So before we call this method, let's go ahead and define this, right? So we have pretty much, I'll just provide the basic definition, so then we can go ahead and fill it in later. So we'll have a method, let's say public static void load alias, alias map, right? And so it is void because we're not going to return anything from this, right? We are just going to update the references that are going to be passed to us via parameters. So we'll have a path first, right? Then we need a map of alias to SKU. Alias to SKU has a key of string, value of string, right? So alias to SKU. We also need one for conflict aliases. That is a set, right? Set of string. So we have conflict aliases, right? And finally, we have one for, let's move this to a second line. So finally, we need to store the reverse mapping of alias to SKU, right? Which is SKU to alias. So that is, remember, it's a little more trickier than the other ones we've seen. So it's still a map, right? A map can have a string key. It can have a string value. It can have an object value. It can have a list of objects as value. In this case, we have a set of string as value. Okay, so that's SKU to alias. Now, that is pretty much our method definition, right? We could actually just literally start filling in the gaps here and start calling this, right? So we will pass to it the alias map path, right? So I think this should have alias map path, right? So we'll pass the alias map path, and then we'll pass alias to SKU. We'll also pass conflict aliases, and then SKU to alias, right? So that's going to be the first call. So let's try to define the other methods so we kind of get an idea, and then we'll go ahead and fill in the methods themselves. All right. So the next method we're going to define was load SKU list, right? This only requires the path, so we can actually define it right now, at least the top level, right? So in this case, what we need is a static method that will return a unique set of SKUs, right? So we have a string here, sorry, set of strings, and we will call it load SKU list, and all it requires is a path, right? So we just need a path here, and it will eventually return some value. So for now, let's return null, meaning there's no value associated with this method when we return something. All right. So that is that. Yeah. So let's try to tackle the first two, where we can load the alias map and load the SKU list. Right. So in our main, right, we would pretty much just load the alias map, and then we can pretty much load the SKU list as well. So if you're loading the SKU list, we just have to give the SKU, I think there's a path variable, right? So last week path. Did I name it incorrectly? No, I think that is fine, right? So last week path, that is fine. So so we're just reading the SKUs from the last week, right? That's what we're looking at here. So we can store this response in, for example, last week SKUs, right? So now let's start filling in some of the gaps, right? So we know we can now we will eventually need all these data structures. We will eventually need to call load alias map and load SKU list. So go ahead and actually implement these now. So load alias map, what are we going to do here? Well, we're going to need to read a file, right? So there are a couple ways to read a file in Java, right? So we have, I believe we have seen buffered reader, right? So Java buffered reader, that's one way to read a file in Java. And so actually the more abstract term that you'll see here is actually a character input stream. That's actually the technical sort of way to define this. It can read a stream, because that doesn't mean it's just a file. It can read a stream of characters that can come in from different sources. That's the idea here. All right. So the one we're going to look at this time though is going to be scanner. Right. So we're going to look at scanner, and so this is a simpler version of reading a stream essentially, right? So some kind of set of characters that are coming in. So it's a simpler version. So let's see how this can be used. So we're going to in our load alias map, right? We're going to declare a variable of type scanner. Let's call it SC for now, and we're going to instantiate the scanner object, right? When you instantiate the scanner object, you pass to the parameterized constructor what is the source essentially, right? So the source in this case is going to be a path, right? And the files class in Java has a static method called new buffered reader. This allows us to provide a path. So if you see there's a path we can provide, and it allows us to read a file. Right, so it'll just we'll be able to read the file, one line at a time and so forth. Right, so this can throw an input-output exception. Right, this method, new buffered reader, because what if the path doesn't exist and so forth. Right, like that's the reason here. So you can throw an exception, and we right now will not handle it. We're just going to let the exception just bubble up. Bubble up meaning if the path doesn't exist, this exception will be thrown by load alias map. It will go up to the main method. And you can already see the main method also needs to handle this potential exception. We're not going to handle it again. We're just going to let it crash the program at this point. Okay. Because if the alias map doesn't exist, there's no point in reading the next set of input files. Okay. So, with this now, we can start reading the contents of the file, right? So you could read, for example, next line in that file using scanner.nextLine. And you can print it out, actually. You can print it out, and if you keep calling scanner.nextLine, it actually keeps going to the next line in that file. So if you keep running this, if you run this code now, so we have sc.nextLine 3 times here, right? So let's look at the alias map here. We have the header, alias and SKU printed. We have the first product, alias to SKU mapping here printed. And we have the next one printed as well. So we have 3 lines printed as a result of calling next line. So that is how a scanner works. It's almost like moving the cursor from the beginning, or essentially not really here, and then reading one line and stopping here. Then you want to read the next line, you can read the next line, it stops there, right? And then kind of moving the cursor, reading the next line and so forth, all right? So that's how the method actually works internally. So we want to not read a single line, right? We want to read n number of lines. It's an unknown number of lines, right? So we can use a while loop in this case. So then we will read the next line only if the next line exists, right? So we don't want to keep reading the next line. We want to actually check, is there a next line? So has next line is a method that on scanner class that returns a boolean for us, all right? So if there's a next line, it will return a true. So then we know that we can continue, all right? So this is exactly the same as doing this. Has next line is equal to true, right? And we could then read the line sc.nextLine, and we will perform the trim here itself. So any trailing sort of spaces and so forth is removed, right? I'll remove this for now. It's just just to show you. Right? Next up, I need to read the line, right? I need to check. Eventually, I need to parse the line, right? But before I get to that part, I need to check a few things. Like, what if the line is empty? You can check, right? What if line is empty, right? So you can check if line dot is empty, right? We can, again, exceptions can be thrown. Right now, we'll keep it very simple. We'll continue, right? We'll just ignore the line for now, okay? And then we're going to take this line and we're going to check, is this a header, right? Because if we're looking at the header of this file, we don't want to read it. We don't want to parse it, actually. We really care about the alias and the SKU, right? So we really care about the contents starting from line number 2. So this is just for any human, right, any one of us reading this file to understand what are we looking at here, right? So we have headers, alias, and SKU. So for that header, we want to be able to skip it, right? So you could use a method on the Java's string class called line.startsWith. So here you can say starts with alias. You can say alias, comma, SKU. We can put the entire thing also. That's perfectly fine. But here we'll just give a partial string here. If it starts with alias and at least the comma, we know that, okay, there's the header. I will just continue again. I will skip that line, okay? So in this case, it's perfectly fine to skip, right? We don't want to parse the header. You could be even more concise here and say, I will convert this to lowercase, right? So I'm going to convert the line. If let's say the user has changed it to alias like this, right? And that's the SKU. So you want to really just make sure you normalize it so you get alias SKU. So you can call the to lowercase method, and then on it, so on this output, which is alias SKU, we can check if this starts with, right, alias. So it just makes it easier to perform a search, right? So that is one way to do it. Now we are at a point where we can start reading the SKU and the alias, right? So let's actually separate the alias and the SKU. So we can use line.split, right? So in Java, in string, there's a method called split where you can pass a delimiter essentially, for example, comma. So we want to split the SKU and the alias by comma, right? Because they're in a comma separated value, CSV file, right? So this returns to us an array of strings, so parts, right? And what we're going to do is we can again perform validation, right? If we don't have enough parts, if parts dot length, for example, is less than 2, right? We need 2, or if it's even not exactly 2, right? If it's not exactly 2, we can skip, for instance, right? We need a key, we need a value, right? We need an alias, we need an SKU. If it is not matching, we can skip. Ideally, you would throw an exception of some sort here, right? Or you can write the errors to some file. There's other ways to tackle this also, right? For now, we'll skip, right? And next part is we want to now get the alias and SKU from parts and make sure we clean them up, right? So we can trim these. So let's take alias raw, for instance. Oops, raw. And let's take the parts at index 0, right? So assume this, right? You're given this kind of a line as input, right? So if this is your input line, right? Now you actually get the parts array will be actually the alias in index 0 and SKU at index 1, right? So that's the array then. So that's a parts array, right? So if this is your input. So we know that the alias is actually at index 0. So I can get that from index 0 and we'll trim it, right? We'll make sure it's nice and clean. And we can do the same for SKU row, and that's at index 1, right? That's it. Now, with this, again, you can perform even more validation, right? What if these are empty? You can perform that validation, you can use continue, throw an exception, and so forth. We'll keep going to the next part now. The next part is actually where we start using this, right? So we want to make sure we add this to the appropriate map, right? So we also want to normalize this a little bit, right? We cleaned it up. We also can go ahead and convert this to lowercase, for instance, to make sure it's easy to search and so forth later. So we can convert this to lowercase, both the alias and the SKU, right? Then we can go ahead and check if the alias exists in the alias to SKU map. So these are the data structures we need to populate, right? These three. So we can check if before we check, go to the if, for instance. Let's take a step back. Let's actually use the map alias to SKU and call the get method, right? And you can check if a key exists, right? So let's say alias raw exists in this map. It will return either null or the alias, right? Oh, sorry, the SKU, right, associated with it. So if the alias does not exist, it returns a null. So you can handle the null scenario using if condition. So if it doesn't exist, we want to add it to the hash map, right? So alias to SKU dot put. We added the alias raw and the SKU raw, right? So we add it here. If it does exist, right, then we have a problem, right? So if an alias to SKU map, right, that we're reading exists, then we have a conflict, right? So we want to make sure we add it to the conflict aliases, right? So we want to add this to this alias raw to that. So we have a set of conflicted aliases in this set. All right. Now, that is how we can use the incoming data structures to track the alias to SKU and the conflict aliases. But what about the third one, right? We also want to do the reverse mapping, SKU to alias. How do we do this? Well, SKU to alias is a map of string where the string key is a string and value is set of string, right? So it's going to be a little different, right? So we will use SKU to alias, right? And we will get, in this case, not the alias, we'll get the SKU, right? So we'll try to get the value for the key where the key is the SKU, right? And the value is a it's a set of string, right? And it will be all the aliases associated with an SKU, right? Now for this set of aliases, if they do not exist, right, then we need to add it, right? So if aliases is equal to null, right, meaning this SKU is a new one, we need to track it, right? So how do we track it? Well, we can create a new value here. So we need to create a new set. Well, this is the value here is actually we have, when we instantiate this, we use where is it? It's a set of string, and we can say let's call this a hash set, right? So it's not going to be a set interface. We'll instantiate it as a hash set. So the value is going to be we can reuse this aliases if it's null, right? And we can instantiate it to a hash set, right? You can declare a new one. You can declare a new set of string, right? New aliases and so forth, right? You can do that as well, right? I'm just going to reuse since we know this is null and we need to insert data into a set of strings. So to this aliases, we're going to, well, given this new set that we're going to set, we're going to use this to set the value for this SKU to alias, right? So for SKU to alias, right, we're going to put here, right, we're going to put the, essentially we're going to put the SKU, right? So we have the key is the SKU raw, and the value now becomes the aliases, right? So that is the way to do this, right? And we can, so you might be wondering why is this instantiated and we're just adding an empty alias, right? What we're going to do is we're just instantiating the value of this map SKU to alias in case it is null, right? And then later, for all conditions, whether there's a value or not for a given SKU raw, we can just add aliases dot add the alias raw, right? That's it. So again, these are all, so aliases here is this set that we will instantiate if it doesn't exist, if the value doesn't exist, right? And then we add it to the SKU to alias map. So when we actually add this alias raw to this aliases, it will update the reference in SKU to alias as well. So this is again a use case of pass by reference in Java, right? Now, that is actually all we need, right? We have updated our SKU to alias, our conflict aliases, alias to SKU. We've actually updated all of them, right? So we have a pretty decent working representation for loading the alias map. Now, let's go back to our main. We have our load alias map, right? So that is set now. The next method we're going to be calling is the load SKU list, right? So load SKU list here, which will give us essentially the last week's SKU, right? Which we'll use to compare to this week's SKUs and so forth. So let's go to load SKU list now. We need to implement this method, right? So this method also just takes in a path, right? And we need to read from a file, we need to parse it, we need to create essentially a set of string, we need to return it, right? That's the idea here. So we're going to read from the SKU list file, right? We need to read, take for each given line, right? For each given line, right, we need to you know, add it to a set essentially, right? So which means we need to declare a set, right? A set of string essentially. And then finally we'll just return, right? That's a rough idea for this method, right? So let's declare. So we have a set we're going to need to use, which is going to be a set of string, and we're going to need to have declare provide name, let's say SKUs, and we'll instantiate this as a hash set, right? Now for this set of SKUs, we're going to be finding it by reading through the file, right? So we'll again declare a scanner, sc, instantiate the scanner, and again we'll use new buffer reader, right? And I'll provide the path, right? So the path is going to be provided by our main at some point, right? So again, exception Java IO, which is going to add it to the signature. And this time it doesn't bubble up, or the compiler doesn't complain here because it's already added to the main, right? As a result of the load alias map, the exception being thrown, that is. So now we're going to again need to read an unknown amount of lines, right? Which will be SKUs. So we will have a while scanner dot has next line. So as long as there is a next line, we want to read the SKU, right? So we'll read the SKU from the next line, and as usual we'll keep trimming it so that we don't have any unintended spaces and stuff. Then what we can do is, right, we can now go ahead and add this to the set, right, essentially. So we could say SKU dot, or in this case SKUs dot add, right? And we can add the SKU here to the set, pretty much, right? Pretty straightforward. We could also, in this case, I'm just thinking, right? Since the SKUs are what we're usually going to consider these as a different kind of casing, uppercase. So we could use either to lowercase, or in this case, let's keep it to uppercase, right? So we will also see a benefit of, we'll see a use case of uppercase here, right? So we'll make sure all SKUs that we read are converted to uppercase. So it's a consistent formatting for all these, right? Then finally, what do we need to do? Let me just put the comment here. So we return the SKUs. That's it. Straightforward here for this one, all right? So that's the load SKU list, all right? Now, the next one, we'll get to load vendor file in a moment. Let's actually go ahead and look back at the main once more, right? So now we should be able to pretty much have a mapping for alias to SKU. We should always also have a last week's SKU. We should be able to read those files, right? So let's actually try this out. Let's actually print out what we get here, right? So let's see, what do we have in our alias map path not alias map path, alias map. Oh, sorry, I'm mixing it up. Alias to SKU map, right? This is the map where we have the alias to SKU mapping. Let's see what is also in last week SKUs. So let's see if we're getting the data now. Right. We're getting a lot of data. So we have, first one is the alias to SKU map, right? So we can see the Xbox series something, it equals to the SKU, and we can see each of the products that we've read, aliases which we have read, right, and the mapping associated with them, right? And then we can also see the last week's SKUs. We can see all the SKUs we've read from our last week SKUs, right? So app MBA, if you search for it, right, there you go, right? Remember, set doesn't care about the order in which data is read, right? So even though there's a line 11 here, it is actually the first element when we print it out, right? So sets doesn't preserve the order, right? That's the reason here. So we're able to now read the files, parse it, and store it in variables. So we are making some good progress. Let's go to the next step then, all right? And as at this stage, you could also take a moment, try to print out conflict alias, SK2 alias, right? Try those out. I would highly recommend that. Okay. But we're going to proceed to the next step here, which is we want to be able to load and process the vendor file, right? So when we process the vendor file, we need to care about what is the set of SKUs we're going to deal with this week, right, on our platform. We need to make available for customers, for example. So we need to declare a set of string, right, and it's going to be for this week's SKUs, and we're going to instantiate the hash set here, right? So I know it's getting repetitive. We're pretty much using hash set for all use cases. You can probably just look at the set interface, see if there's any more interesting use case for others, right? So set in Java. When you're getting started, it's okay with the repetition, but there are a couple other implementations of sets. But you can probably explore, for example, linked hash set, and yeah, tree set and so forth is a little different. So it's going to be, I would say these two are probably the two you can sort of try. If you're really feeling adventurous, you can try out, look into copy on write, right? That's an interesting one. All right, but let's keep it to hash set for now, and we'll continue on this. Right? The next variable we need to declare is essentially for unknown aliases, right? So there will be certain aliases we don't have a mapping for, so we need to track that, right? So we'll have a set of string, right, for unknown aliases. We'll instantiate this, right? And again, hash set, right? Same implementation here. Now what do we need to do? We need to call load vendor file, right? So let's collapse these methods for now. We have a load vendor file method we need to define now, right? So we already kind of know what the load vendor file will take, right? So it's going to, so let's define this. So we have a public static method. So we did now define the return type, right? So let's follow the same approach we did for the load alias map. So we'll have a void, and we'll pass the appropriate references, and then have the method update them, right? So we have load vendor file. We need a path, right? We need, for instance, the alias to SKU. So we pretty much have this map coming in here, handy, right? And then we also have this week's SKUs. That's just a set of strings, right? So we have this coming in, and we also need an unknown set of aliases. So let's cover that here. Okay. So that's our essentially method definition we have. How do we implement this? Well, we are going to again need to read a file, right? So we can literally just go here, copy the scanner. You're definitely going to need this, right? And you might need a few other things, but let's copy this over. All right, there you go. That's definitely going to be required. You're going to read a path. You're going to need to throw an exception, right? Throws an exception, right? So it's an unhandled exception, right? And then you're going to need to read the input. So what do we need to tackle here, right? So for each vendor, right, there are going to be similar patterns we're going to see with the alias map processing. There's a header which when you're going to process the file, we don't really care about. We really care about lines 2 and beyond, right? And then we pretty much have the alias, the price, and the stock. That's what we need to track, right? So let us tackle that, and let's process the file, right? So we're going to get the file. So I'm literally again going to go back here and copy the next line .trim. So we're going to need this as well, right? So we're going to read the next line, right? As long as there is a next line, and we're going to store it in somewhere, right? And again, you can again have the if line is empty check, right? You can have continue, for instance. You can check the header, right? So we will actually check the header. If line dot to lowercase, just as we did earlier, right? If it starts with alias, right? And if it does, we're going to continue. We'll skip that header, right? And now we can start parsing our line, right? So in this case, what is it that we're going to need, right? Well, we are going to first start by splitting, right? Let's start by splitting this, right, into parts, which is the line dot split method and comma base separation. Then we can again do the checks for, if parts dot length is less than, in this case we need at least two, we need really, we actually kind of need we really need the alias, right? That is absolutely required. We will do the mapping to the SKU, right? We actually in this problem don't really look at price, and we don't really look at stock either. So you could try to look at ways how you would use this in a given problem, but in this problem we don't really care about this. So we could say, if you have less than um, you know less than 4 elements, then that's a problem. But we really just care about one. So we're going to say less than 1, right? So if it's less than 1, continue, for instance. Again, these I'm just going to leave these up to you as an exercise to do the validation. Okay. Now we're going to take the alias, right? So string alias, again as we did earlier, alias raw parts sub 0, and we'll trim it, right? And again, you can have check if alias raw is empty. What do we do? We can continue, for instance, right? And now we're going to need to check this alias in our SKU, right? In our alias to SKU map, right? Before we do that, we need to convert this to lowercase, because we convert all of our alias and SKUs to lowercase, right? So before we make the check in the alias to SKU map, convert this to lowercase. Then in alias to SKU, try to get the alias row, right? Store that in, for example, a variable SKU, right? So it's an alias to SKU mapping, so we should get an SKU value. If it equals to null, right, we can do a check here. If it equals to null, we could just add it to unknown aliases now, right? So if the SKU doesn't, if the alias doesn't have an appropriate SKU, that means we don't have a mapping. We lack a mapping. So it's an unknown alias. So you can add it here to the unknown alias set, right? Once you add it, you can continue actually. You don't want to proceed to the next steps, right? Because the next step will be assuming that the alias is valid and it exists in the mapping, alias to SKU. So if it does exist, well, we know this is a SKU for this week, right? So this week.SKUs, let's add it, add this SKU to this set of strings. And believe it or not, that's actually all we need for this method. We're going to process the vendor file, right? We're going to pretty much, read the first column or first sort of value in this vendor file, which is the alias. We don't really need to process the price or the stock, right? So we're just going to read the alias and we're going to check the map. If it does not exist, then, well, we don't have a mapping, so it's unknown alias. Otherwise, add it to this week's SKUs, right? So with this, we actually have an implementation for load vendor file, right? So we can actually go back again to our main now, where we have called the load vendor file. So we can actually try to call load vendor file, for instance, with one of the arguments. We can actually say path.off args sub not 0, not 1. It should be 2 or above, right? So in this case, we know we will get index 2, 0, 1, 2, and 3, right? So you could actually test it by passing args sub 0, for instance, or args sub, sorry, 2, for instance, right? So let me actually declare, so you could actually do that, and then you could pass, for instance, the alias to SKU. You could pass this week SKUs and unknown aliases, right? This can be used just for as a test. Are you able to read these files, right? So then you can, for instance, print this week's SKUs. So I'm going to execute this. and looking good. Looks like we're able to read the SKUs. Read the essentially the file and identify the SKUs for this week. So for example, Galaxy S Ultra, let's see if there's a mapping. The mapping is SAM something, right? So we should have SAM S24 right here. There you go. So the mapping is present. So that's how you can check as well. Now, this is not enough, right? We want to do it for an unknown number of vendor files coming in, right? You can have 2 vendor files, you can have 10 vendor files, and so forth. So, we would ideally want to go through a for loop, right? You could consider while, but in this case, for is okay because you actually know the length of the arguments array, right? So actually the size of so you would actually in this case have a var I starting at 2, right? You want to start at 2 and you want to go till the I is less than args dot length, right? So so in this case you don't really need a while loop, right? And you increment I at each point, and at each point you're going through the arguments. You want to load vendor file, right? And for each of these vendor file path that we're going to access, we want to read the vendor file. We want to update our alias to SKU, right? That's our global solution. I mean, I shouldn't say global. It's our shared alias to SKU across all vendor files, right? And we want to have all of this week's SKUs in a single set. We want to track all of our unknown aliases in a single set, right? So we're not partitioning it by different vendors, right? We're just storing them all in a single set at this point. So with this, well, we can actually start outputting the results of this data set, right? What do we need to do here? Well, we need to figure out the kind of the deltas, right? We need to kind of figure out what are the discontinued items, right? That is one that we touched upon earlier. So let's actually do that. So deltas or discontinued items, for instance, right? So we have a set of okay. Well, let me sort of take a second here, right? How do we figure out the discontinued items, right? That is the one. That is the challenge here. So we have this week's SKUs, right? And if we and we also have from this last week SKUs, right? We also have a set of last week SKUs. So if you actually think about it, if if you have a last week SKUs, and from it, if you remove whatever is in this week's SKUs, you actually get discontinued items. What do I mean? Let's go back to this sheet. So in the last week SKUs, we had, for example, this one. Now, when we compute, for example, this week's SKUs, right? Let's say we have everything else, or let's say we have these, for instance, right? So these are the ones we have. That means one is missing, this is missing, these are all gone, right? These are all gone for this week, right? So if we actually remove from this week's, essentially last week's SKUs, if you try to remove this week's SKUs, you actually get the discontinued items, right? So we're going to take that logic and apply that here. So you could do this in using loops and so forth, but I'll just show you the way which collection framework actually makes it easier for us in this case. Right? So we can compute. What we need to do is we need to first compute the new SKUs and the discontinued SKUs, right? So there can be new SKUs that are coming in that doesn't exist already, right? So let's say something like this. So there's a new SKU that wasn't there last week, right? So we need to compute this, and also we need to figure out what are the discontinued ones. That's a problem statement. So, so we need new SKUs. We need to compute that and the discontinued SKUs, right? So let's. What we're going to do is we're going to create a set of this week's SKUs. So we'll create So think about this in a mathematical sense. So from a set of this week's SKUs, we're going to essentially subtract or remove, right? Remove last week's SKUs, right? So from this week's SKUs, if you remove last week's SKUs, you actually get the new ones, the new SKUs, right? Similarly, right, from the set of last week's SKUs, right, remove this week's SKUs, you actually get the discontinued SKUs. Okay, so that's the way we're going to tackle this. All right, what is the error here? Misplaced apostrophe. Okay, fine. So let us, as a result, create a set of string, right? So we're going to see a lot of set use case here. Think about why. It's primarily because we want unique values, right? We don't want to deal with any duplicates in any way. So that's what we're using set here. So we have a set of new SKUs, let's say, right? And we'll create a new hash set, right? And what we're going to do is, to the constructor of this hash set, we're going to pass, what is it? We're going to pass this week's SKUs, right? So we're going to create a pretty much a new set of this week's SKUs. The reason is we don't want to make changes to the existing set, okay? And the change we're going to perform is, from new SKUs, we're going to remove not a single object, we're going to remove a collection of objects. So there is a method remove all, and what can we pass to it? We want to remove last week's SKUs. That is this set. So we can pass last week's SKUs. There you go. That actually removes from this set the values in this last week's SKUs, right? So that will allow us to get the new SKUs, all right? Similarly, right? We are just going to, I'm just going to copy this for now. Similarly, we have essentially discontinued SKUs, right? And for this, we care about, we need to instantiate this variable with last week's SKUs, right? And from the last week's SKUs, we want to remove this week's SKUs, right? So, sorry, this week's SKUs. So that is from discontinued SKUs, we want to remove this week's SKUs. So now you have, what are the new SKUs that will be available on your platform? So new products for this week, essentially. And which products are discontinued from your platform, right? So now you go back to that problem statement, right? You're Amazon, sellers are supplying all these product lists. Every week you have to perform this computation of figuring out what the outcome essentially is, of figuring out what is the set of products that's going to be available on your site this week, and which of those are new products, right? And which of the older products are gone, they're discontinued, right? That's essentially what we're doing here on a small scale, right? So that's what we've done. Let's now print out our output, right? So we have, let's say output. Well, our output can be pretty much all the key aspects we need, right? So let's format it a little bit. Let's say summary of the data. So almost like a report that you would generate, for instance. 3, 4, right? There you go. So first we can print out, for instance, this week SKUs. So what are the SKUs for this week? And you can just print the size for now, because if you start printing all the elements, it's going to be too many, right? And we'll print the size of last week SKUs, right? So last week SKUs. Then you can print out, okay, how many new SKUs have come in? Right? So new SKUs, right? You can also understand, okay, how many products have been discontinued, right? So discontinued SKUs, right? What else? We have unknown aliases, right? So we have some errors. So we need to track or flag the errors, right? So we have unknown aliases, right? That's also one. So unknown aliases. There's no mapping in terms of our SKUs, right, for these aliases. We also have aliases with a conflict, right, in our alias mapping, right? So certain aliases, right, the conflicts in alias map, right? So that is in conflict aliases, right? So we have conflict aliases that gets updated in the load alias map as well. So we have conflict aliases, right? We're printing out just the size, which is essentially using it's like a length, calling length on an array, right? You're getting the number of elements in each of these, right? And then you can print, if you want, you can print a few of some of these values. Like, for example, if you want to print maybe up to 10 of the new SKUs, right? You can have a loop, for instance, var I is equal to 0, I is less than new SKUs, right? Dot size, I plus plus. So this is how you would pretty much iterate over, one of these data structures, right? And we can print out, for instance, instead of I-based iteration, what I would recommend actually for most of these collection is for each based iteration actually would be nice, because then it just makes it more concise. So if you have we essentially want to print out the new SKUs, right, which is a set of string. So there's a string str and we have new SKUs, right? So it just makes it a little simpler. So you can print out so ut str, right? If you want to print out a maximum amount, you can actually just keep a track. Int count is equal to 0. Keep track of how many elements you are printing, right? So and then increment the count. Now if count is equal to, let's say, 10, right, you can break, for instance, in this case, right? So it's a little different from that for loop with the I iteration, but essentially you get pretty much same outcome. So this is our summary. So think about it like a report that you're getting, right? You're running the platform. This week we have 12 SKUs. Last week we had 13. There are 12 new SKUs and 13 discontinued SKUs. All right. And we have unknown aliases 1, alias conflicts in alias map. So one conflict. So one alias has a conflict, right? So this, so the validation here is going to be the tricky part, right? We have a bunch of files coming in. You have to go and check them individually. So if we have to look at this week's SKUs, you would, we can debug and check also. All right, so this week's SKUs are, so can, IRO, GGL, all right. So we have, and last week we had 13 items in this SKUs set. And okay, then new SKUs are 12, right? So, and discontinued are essentially 13. So that seems to be, I think, I get a sense that is maybe a touch on the higher end, but let's see. Yeah, because new SKUs should ideally be not so high, right? So let's break here for a second, right? And so what should, let's go back to new SKUs for a second, how we declare this. So set new SKUs, and we have this week's SKUs, and from this set, we removed last week's SKUs. I think there's probably a little mismatch in terms of upper and lower case. Let's just check that. Yeah, so there seems to be an upper and lowercase specific issue here. So I think that is because we down here, I think, converted our SKUs. So this load SKU is called right here, right? That is the last week's SKU, and we converted this to uppercase, right? So let's actually switch it back to, let's say, lowercase, and then let's try real quick. All right, now it's looking more realistic, right? So the issue was that since our casing was wrong, right, when we try to remove elements, remove from this week's SKU, we try to remove last week SKUs, well, that was not working, right? Because the matching was not, we were not able to match the set, the string in this set to this week's SKU, right? So now that the match, the casing is actually working. So if you debug now, you can actually see this week's SKU, right, all lowercase, great. Last week's SKU, all lowercase, right? So you can actually then look at can EOSR, and you can see, okay, does it exist here? Right, there you go. Right. So that's how you can sort of validate real quick. Okay, so if the numbers don't add up, then that means there's definitely something wrong. So now we actually have something more realistic. So I'll maybe create another video where we can go into how do you actually validate this in a programmatic sense, right? So that's going to be a little more longer. So let me stop this video at this point, and we can create something else later.